Rome, 146 years before Christ. As its empire expanded outward, its laws grew colder within. In the heart of the marketplace, where olives, goats, and slaves were traded, a different kind of sale unfolded. A Roman woman, clothed in shame and silence, stood bound at the wrists. Her husband stood beside her, calling out prices like a merchant. This was not a scandal. It was legal. She was not a criminal. She was his wife, and Roman law saw her not as a person but as property, to be disposed of in public view. The power of a Roman man was not just respected, it was absolute. Under the weight of manus law, a husband's authority extended over every part of a woman's existence. A wife did not share in property. She was the property. This was more than tradition, it was written into the bones of Roman society. Once married, a woman passed from her father's hand to her husband's, like cattle moving from one owner to another. And if that husband grew tired of her, if she aged too soon, failed to bear sons, or simply no longer pleased him, he could cast her out like broken pottery. Divorce required no cause, no consent, no ceremony. A man could simply announce his rejection, and she was no longer his wife. In some cases, he could take it further. He could bring her to the marketplace. The same forum where coins clinked and olives were bartered now echoed with the auctioneer's voice, and his wares could be a living, breathing woman. Standing bound before sneering crowds, a wife might be priced, appraised, and offered like a slave. There were no official edicts permitting such sales, but neither were there laws forbidding them. In the eyes of the state, if a man claimed the right, and if no one stopped him, then it was law enough. The forum's magistrates might look away, the priests might murmur disapproval, but they would not interfere. And the crowd would watch. Some laughed, others placed bets. Boys mimicked the scene in play, pulling ropes around dolls and pretending to sell them. Rome taught its sons that a woman's worth began and ended in the hands of men. And so the law of manus was not only enforced through scrolls and statutes, it was enforced through silence, spectacle, and fear. The women who were sold in those markets left no record. Their names were scrubbed from tablets, their voices erased from the histories. What remains are glimpses, fragments in legal texts, jokes in satirical plays, mentions in courtroom insults. But behind each fragment was a woman with a story no one bothered to write. One of them stood in the forum that year, wrists chafed from rope, eyes locked on the man who had once vowed to protect her. She was not his wife anymore. She was something far more fragile in Rome, unwanted property, and now she was for sale. Claudia Severina had once been the image of Roman virtue. She was graceful, educated, and dutiful, born to a family that prized discipline above comfort. Her father had given her away in marriage at 17, sealing an alliance that strengthened his position in the Senate. To the public eye, she was blessed, a wife of a wealthy merchant, draped in silk, attended by slaves. Yet in the marble silence of her home, she lived like an obedient ghost, speaking only when spoken to, moving as though under invisible chains. Her husband, Lucius Varro, was known for his temper and his pride. When whispers reached Claudia that he kept a young slave girl in his chambers, she did the one thing a Roman wife was never supposed to do. She confronted him. "You dishonor our home," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken. Lucius turned to her slowly, his face the calm of a man used to being feared. "A slave cannot dishonor me," he replied, "but a wife who forgets her place can." That night, she was locked in her chamber without food. Servants averted their eyes as he declared to the household that Claudia had become unfit for marriage. In the following days, he began preparing her sale. To modern ears, it sounds impossible, monstrous, but in Rome, it was not madness, it was a loophole. Though no statute explicitly sanctioned the sale of wives, a husband could transfer possession of his household property, and under manus, a wife was counted among his possessions. Claudia's protests meant nothing. Her father, bound by shame and politics, refused to intervene. When Lucius announced the sale, he even posted a public notice in the forum beside the bread stalls and wine cellars. On the morning of the sale, Claudia was led through the crowded streets. Some citizens turned away in discomfort, others leaned closer, hungry for scandal. She walked barefoot, her hair unbound, a symbol of disgrace. The crowd gathered thick around the rostra, their laughter rising like a cruel tide. Lucius raised his hand and declared his intent to sell a disobedient woman unworthy of a Roman household. He spoke her name as if spitting it out. Claudia tried to speak, to plead, to remind them of the law that granted her the dignity of citizenship, but her voice drowned beneath the market's roar. She shouted lines from the 12 tables, the very foundation of Roman law, hoping some magistrate would remember justice. None did. Coins clattered at her feet as bidders jeered and mocked. She felt the world closing in, the marble beneath her toes burning from shame. The husband she once loved watched her with the detached gaze of a trader finalizing a deal, and as a stranger placed payment in his hand, Claudia understood the truth of Rome, that law was not written to protect the weak, but to preserve the power of those who owned them. In that moment, she ceased being a wife. She became a warning. The marketplace was Rome's theater, and nothing drew a crowd like humiliation. When a wife was sold by her husband, it was more than a transaction, it was a performance. The spectators did not gather because they were merchants. They came because they were Romans. In a culture where strength was praised and silence in women was expected, the public sale of a wife became both punishment and warning. It fed the appetite of a society that thrived on dominance, not just over enemies, but over the bodies of its own. Men leaned in with folded arms, judging the posture of the woman, her cleanliness, her age, her voice if she dared to speak. Boys laughed, mimicking the way sellers shouted out faults. "Cannot bear sons," one boy cried out, and the crowd erupted in laughter. Beside him, his father clapped him on the shoulder with pride. This was not a family tragedy. This was public education. Roman culture rewarded control. A man who could cast aside a wife and replace her without shame was seen as assertive, decisive, even noble. Hesitation would have brought suspicion. Was he weak? Was he ruled by emotion? But a man who sold his wife in the open displayed certainty, confidence, a complete understanding of his power. It was a ritual of authority, and the crowd admired him for it. Some men attended these auctions not to buy, but to learn. They watched how to speak, how to gesture, how to maintain composure as their wife wept or screamed. They studied the posture of a man unbothered by guilt. They learned how to be Roman. And the women who were forced to stand on the stone steps, wrists bound or arms held by guards, learned a lesson too. They learned what waited for them if they spoke too loudly, questioned too boldly, or aged too quickly. It was not just Claudia Severina who had been sold that year. There had been others. Some came from lower houses, wives of lesser merchants, farmers, even freedmen. Their names were never recorded. Their faces blurred into one memory of trembling lips and downcast eyes, and yet each woman taught the same lesson. In Rome, obedience was survival. Respect was not earned, it was expected. The market became a mirror reflecting the empire's soul, and what stared back was not honor or wisdom, but spectacle. A woman's shame became everyone's entertainment, and beneath it all, the law stood silent. For every magistrate who looked away, every priest who refused to intervene, every citizen who laughed instead of objected, each became part of the ritual. The sale of wives was not Rome's secret, it was its sport, and for the crowd, it was not about coins or contracts, it was about watching power in action. A woman being broken in public reminded them that they lived in a world where power did not need to justify itself, it only needed to be seen. Before a husband ever raised his voice to a wife in the forum, it was the father who set the foundation. In Rome, the law of patria potestas, the power of the father, was older than the republic itself. A Roman father did not merely guide his children, he owned them. Sons, daughters, grandchildren, even adult sons with children of their own, if the patriarch still breathed, they all answered to him. And among them, daughters were the most vulnerable. A girl born into a Roman household was considered a blessing only if she could be used. A marriage alliance, a dowry exchange, a political tool. If she was lucky, her father would marry her off to someone within her rank. If he was desperate, she could be sold, not figuratively sold. There were records, faint and scattered, of fathers transferring their daughters into servitude, especially during times of famine or debt. These sales were disguised under legal contracts, using terms like temporary household placement or labor repayment, but everyone knew what they meant. A young girl would be sent into another man's home to serve without rights, sometimes indefinitely. There were even cases, some found in legal writings and satire, where fathers sold the same daughter multiple times, each time buying her back only to sell her again when coin ran low. The law did not intervene. The law was the father. As long as he lived, his daughter had no independent standing, no legal identity of her own. She could not bring a case to court, she could not inherit, she could not even refuse marriage. Rome praised this as order, as discipline. Fathers were seen as the pillars of morality, and yet, beneath that marble ideal stood thousands of girls, silent, traded, forgotten. Some were sold before they had reached their first blood, others, not long after. Puberty was not a season of protection, it was a deadline. The earlier she could be wed or placed, the better. Every year past the age of 12 made her harder to sell. The market did not reward delay. This was not a crime. This was economy. Fathers who acted this way were not shamed, they were pitied, perhaps, or envied. And their daughters? They learned to survive. Some complied. Some ran. A few, like Claudia Severina later would, tried to speak. But from the start, the message was clear. A Roman girl was not born to be loved. She was born to be used. Even if she escaped the hands of her father, she would fall into the hands of a husband. From cradle to contract, from home to forum, she was passed between men like a coin that never lost its value, only its voice. Rome may have sculpted gods and written laws, but beneath every triumphal arch was a girl who had never been asked what she wanted, because Rome never asked. It only took. Gaius Petronius was not the first Roman man to discard a wife like worn sandals, but he was the first to be noticed. A wealthy landowner with political ambitions, he had married 3 times by the age of 40. Each union began with lavish ceremonies, golden rings, and vows whispered under torchlight, and each one ended the same way: public rejection. He was known throughout the forum not for his speeches or his business acumen, but for the way he handled his divorces. He made them theatrical. His first wife, Livia, was dismissed for lack of fertility. He cited her barrenness as a moral failure, then held a celebratory feast the same day she was sent back to her father's house. His second, Flavia, was accused of excessive gossip. He auctioned her in the lower market, just beside the olive stalls, and invited fellow senators to witness his act of purification. Some applauded, others looked away. His third wife, however, was not so easily discarded. Her name was Junia Calvina, daughter of a powerful senator and cousin to a consul. When Petronius began whispering rumors about her dishonor and prepared yet another public dismissal, Junia did something unheard of. She pushed back. She did not cry. She did not run. She gathered her witnesses, hired an advocate, and brought a case not against her husband's right to divorce her, but against the manner in which he did it. She accused him not of illegality, but of cruelty. The court could not outlaw the divorce. It was allowed, but what followed shocked even the judges. Junia's advocate read out testimony from slaves, market sellers, and even children who had seen the previous wife sales. They described laughter, humiliation, mocking chants. The courtroom, usually calm, shifted uneasily. What was being judged was not just one man, it was a culture. In the end, Petronius was not imprisoned, he was not stripped of his rank, but the court imposed a fine, the equivalent of several years' income, under the vague offense of disturbing Roman virtue. It was a phrase meant to soothe both sides. For some, it was the beginning of justice, for others, an overreach, but for Petronius, it was a scar. His reputation never recovered. No woman of rank would marry him again. Whispers followed him through every corridor, not because he sold his wives, but because one of them had dared to challenge the sale. Junia became both praised and hated. To some, she was a protector of Roman dignity. To others, a disobedient wife who had embarrassed a man in court. But something had shifted. The law had not changed. Yet for the first time, Rome had been forced to look at itself, not through marble statues, but through a woman's eyes, and the reflection was ugly. They teach the world that Rome gave us laws, that it gave us roads, aqueducts, poetry, philosophy, and the architecture of civilization itself. And in many ways, that is true. But beneath the marble columns and stoic busts lies a truth that never makes it into textbooks. Rome also gave us silence, the kind that follows a woman's scream when no one comes, the kind carved into the cracks of a forum's stone floor, where sandals once stood while a wife was priced like livestock, the kind that echoed in the hearts of daughters sold by their fathers before they even knew what marriage meant. The Republic did not collapse because of war alone. It began to rot from within, where power became law, and law became performance. In that world, a woman's value was not measured by her mind or her loyalty, but by the usefulness her body offered to the men who claimed it. And when that usefulness ended, she was cast out not quietly, not privately, but with spectacle. These were not acts of desperation, they were rituals of dominance. They reminded the people who mattered and who did not. Rome didn't have to hide its cruelty, it celebrated it. And so, stories like Claudia Severina's were not rare. They were simply erased. When a wife was sold, her name was not etched in history, only the man's actions were preserved in satire, in law, in debate. She disappeared into the crowd, replaced, forgotten, renamed, but the pain did not vanish with her. It lingered, passed down in the bodies of other women taught to obey, to fear, to serve in silence. The same empire that sculpted Venus with marble curves had no room for the real women who bled and aged and refused to break. And even now, centuries later, we inherit the ruins of what they built. Rome taught us how to build empires, but it also taught us how easy it is to dehumanize those who are not allowed to speak. The Roman wife was not weak, she was not silent by choice. She was erased by design, and today, we write her back into history not to glorify the past, but to expose it. She deserves more than dust, she deserves memory, because no civilization is truly great if it leaves its women in chains. If this story moved you, and if you want to uncover more hidden truths from history they never taught in school, subscribe, comment your thoughts, and join us as we unearth the forgotten stories of the ancient world.